Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Hopefully you took a nice break from the last section. I've also done the same and had a few days off, which was very much needed. I think it was was it the ISM that we did last? I believe it was no, it was payrolls, wasn't it? So payrolls took a little bit of time. We're now actually going to be, as you can see there, going to be covering the Fed, the FOMC, one of the most important sections in the whole course, and definitely one of the most difficult for me to explain. So, be patient, be prepared for a long session here, but a very, very important session. Very poorly understood. The Federal Reserve, its function, how it influences interest rates, why these things matter. In particular, its dual mandate that is being basically given by law, statutory law. Its goals are to promote maximum employment, to promote stable prices, and also to maintain kind of moderate long-run interest rates, right, which helps achieve those goals. And don't worry, we're going to talk about all of this. If it's quite new to you or you weren't aware of those things, obviously the Fed needs objectives given to it. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of why the Fed is even there and who gives the objectives and all of that. We're going to cover it, but very poorly understood topic. And again, like I was saying in the previous section, to make sure that I'm giving you the right information. Normally, especially with the Pro and Foundation course, I didn't really have to do that much research because obviously I'm trading every day, and it's very easy for me to describe how the market functions, as in the financial market, the intraday market. With fundamentals, very, very difficult because to understand it from a practical perspective, you really need to understand it from a deep theoretical perspective. And obviously, I'm not teaching theory every day. I don't work in a university or school, and so I'm not teaching this stuff every day. So obviously, for me to make sure that I'm giving you 10 times more than what you're paying for in this course, I need to make sure the quality of information is the best. And to do that, obviously, I am carrying out a little bit of research in this for this fundamentals course in the background. It's, in particular, this understanding section. And I know I'm talking a lot. We will get onto exciting. Well, it's not really that exciting, but I think it is. But interesting stuff, and we are going to talk about the Fed and so on. But it's important I say all this. When I was doing the research for this section, I just noticed how poor things are out there, right? And I said that about ISM and all of it, basically the labor market. And I'm sure you're realizing that because I encourage you. And the reason I'm telling you all this, I want you to do research, your own research on all of these sections. I'm here to help you and guide you and tell you where to look. And and without sounding too arrogant, you'd probably be completely lost unless I told you where to look. And I was too, but obviously I worked with some incredible individuals who also guided me. So I'm just passing that on to you and that information. But also I think you can help yourself a lot by doing your own research, and I'm going to suggest places that you can look and read up, and just like I did with the other sections, but in particular this, you can do your own research. But you will notice yourself, don't need to take my word for it, that the information is just so poor, number one. And the more you read and I explain to you and you start doing your research, you're going to be shocked how it's going to become so obvious to you how poorly understood the entire financial market is by people who talk about financial markets, and I bash retail a lot, but it's true, right? You watch these YouTube videos and trading videos and people trying to explain the Fed to you and why the decisions are important. Complete and utter embarrassment, right? And I'm going to show you that. Best place to probably start, because it's such a vast topic, best place for us to start is by just talking a little bit about the history of the Fed And what you can do, right? So what we're going to do, as always, is let's just have a quick recap where we are Just make sure I'm not blocking anything. And by the way, my face is going to be a little bit darker than in some videos because I'm filming in the daytime right now, so I need to put the light on. I know this is off topic, but I like to share these things with you because I want it to be that type of course that isn't just, some sort of manufactured perfection. That is not the case. But I've got this light on, and you probably know the YouTubers and all these guys, they have these ring lights in front of them that shine in their face, and the reason they do that, when they're using green screens and so on, the light shines and you can see it causes a bit of a shadow on the face, so they put light in front of them to increase the light all around, to get rid of that shadow. And the problem is, I don't want the light in my face. I find it extremely distracting, so forgive me. But this isn't a gimmick of some sort. I've never understood why people focus so much on that stuff. It's a very serious topic, as you're about to see, so I really don't want the light in my face distracting me. I want to give this 100% attention, so I just want to mention that. But I hope it doesn't look too bad, right? I'm just looking at the recording now up. Looks alright, so I think just obviously ignore my face. I'm sure you ignore my face all the time anyway. But I just wanted to mention that. So, and it's good we start off on a light-hearted note because we're about to get very serious. So obviously we're going to focus here on FOMC. You might be wondering why we jumped a bit, that CPI was before this. So we've done all of this in incredible detail. I'm going to skip CPI and retail sales and come back to it. I want to cover the FOMC, okay? It's the most important section. And there's a reason I want to cover it first. It's because the FOMC... basically, the FOMC is not the ultimate body, okay? It's actually directed by Congress. Okay, Congress is obviously the ultimate kind of legislator for the United States, sets laws and responsible for everything, essentially, how the country functions. And one of those functions is the FOMC. Okay, so everything comes from Congress, and obviously you've got the Senate within Congress, and we're not here to learn about all of that. That's obviously a history or a different topic. Okay, we're here to learn about trading. So I'm not going to go into incredible detail about this. You can read up about Congress if you want, if you're not familiar with their function, but obviously they are the ultimate, ultimately responsible for laws and how the whole country functions, not only from a economic perspective, but from a day-to-day, life perspective, laws and things you have to abide by and all of those things. And one of their functions is economic, right? So they set up the FOMC and tasked it and brought an act, I think it's the Federal Reserve Act, and we'll talk a little bit about it. But ultimately, the FOMC was set up, I think around 1915, 1913, I can't remember. You can obviously have a look at the history of the FOMC in your own time. But ultimately, and it is relevant to why I skipped ahead, the FOMC was given mandates, not at that time, but over time, right? As kind of economic shocks happened. So throughout the 20th century, I don't know when, I think it was employment first, then unemployment shock. So they decided to task or set a legal requirement for the FOMC by law, as in to have a mandate, a legal mandate, to maintain or promote maximum employment. To make sure that every American that wants a job potentially can get a job. And obviously that's not realistic, but at least that should be its target, right? So it was employment. Okay, and we discussed that here. Do you see? So we've already covered that. But the other one was when, I think it was around the 70s or 70s, maybe the early 80s or 70s, there was some massive price shocks. Prices, I don't know the inflation rate, but maybe 20% or whatever the price shocks were around the world, in particular United States as well as other countries. Prices got out of control. And obviously Congress, being responsible for the functioning of the whole country, decided to task the FOMC with bringing that under control. okay, as in a specific target centered around prices. So price stability, okay. And these things are so poorly understood. I'm going to explain them to you in my own way. I don't think they're explained very well at all. You can obviously, everything I tell you, I don't want you to take my word for it. Go and do your research and you'll see yourself how very poorly described all of these things are. And I think the best way to understand them is with the circular flow of income, and we're going to talk about that. But ultimately the FOMC has been targeted with these two things, and then obviously maintaining moderate interest rates in the long run. But interest rates are basically the tool they're used to influence employment, influence price stability. Okay, and price stability is measured in certain ways. The CPI isn't the Fed's preferred measure. They do have a slightly different measure which we can talk about, but it is ultimately heavily correlated with their preferred measure, and it's very early in the month. It's ultimately the inflation picture, right? That's what this is, price stability. What's the level of general prices? This is inflation. So that's this bit here, CPI. Okay, it's what the market likes to look at, even though the Fed looks at CPI, but it also has its own slight different measure, which we can discuss, but it's ultimately very similar. They tend to correlate very, very highly, CPI, and the market obviously likes to look at CPI because it's released quite early in the month, and obviously the market likes it, so needs to be given attention. And ultimately, like I said, it all boils down to the same thing. It's measuring price stability. So don't worry, we're going to discuss price stability, employment, why these things are important. In fact, we've already discussed employment, but we can talk about it again just at the same time. Point is, this was one of the reasons I wanted to bring in the FOMC now, is because I thought, okay, we've discussed employment. Let's now talk about the ultimate overseer of these things, the FOMC, and then we can move on to price stability. So let's do that now. So let me just get rid of some of this. So we'll talk about, obviously we have already got this, I believe we've built this already, right, in part 1 of the course. So you've already got your timetable, which we can talk about. They're not, just to remind you, they don't meet, I think it's 8 times a year, right? So 8 times a year. They don't meet every month, so this won't be on your calendar, and it's not done on a regular basis in the sense of the same day every time. It's always, you can see it slightly different weeks in the month, and so it can be a little bit sporadic, but it's by far the most important, I guess you could call it release, but it's more an event that happens where the Fed will be announcing their intentions for the interest rate, but it has far-reaching effects, which we're going to discuss now. So it's kind of a tricky one, because we could start either way. We could start with kind of the history of the Fed and why they're there, or we could start with why interest rates are so important. In fact, let's start with why interest rates are really important, and price stability and employment, and maybe we can link it in. We could start with either, really. They're both just as both work hand in hand. So I would suggest, right, obviously take notes throughout this whole thing. The best thing for you to do is think about the circular flow of income. To me, different people will explain this to you in different ways, and I'm not saying I'm by any means the Bible of all this stuff and the only way and the right way, but in my opinion, this has really helped me throughout my investment banking career. And I used to have a lot of clients, hedge funds, and even money managers and different types of clients basically that used to come to the investment bank, and I would have to have these discussions with them, and my understanding, I felt, was really very high level, not because I was talking to them about everything in terms of the circular flow of income, but because I always had it in my head. So I'd find it easy to have conversations with economists and from these customers that I had, hedge funds, money managers, and even central banks to an extent. When we're talking about money market operations, I used to have conversations with them because I had a rotation on that desk and many different desks. I just found it easy, I felt, than my peers to talk to these other professionals, because I thought of things in my mind anyway, not necessarily out loud, but in my mind in terms of the circular flow of income. And that's where I just feel that it's very poorly explained, these things. So best thing to do is think of the circular flow of income, again, consumer, right, business. Okay. We've talked about this many times, right, in detail. So the things that I feel are really poorly explained are inflation, right? So you read about inflation and people say, hey, inflation 2%, yeah, all well and good, but why? Why do we need inflation? Why do we even need prices to go up? Surely it's a bad thing, right, for prices to be going up. Why do we need GDP, right? These things I feel are very poorly explained. For some reason, I don't know why it is. They're just very badly explained. A lot of people just assume that that you need inflation at 2% or you need inflation to go up. Basically, the way I like to think of it, and I don't know why people don't talk about this, it should be mentioned more, is there's a capacity in the economy. Okay, I really struggled early in my career to understand inflation in particular, and interest rates and just the whole GDP and the whole economy, basically. How and why do central banks around the world target prices? Why do they target 2%? And it was all never really found anything, even in text or anywhere, until I might have read it somewhere, I don't know, but this thing about capacity really stuck in my mind. Okay, and I think it's really, really important. To me, if you understand this, right, you're going to understand one of the most complex topics in finance, but you're going to really understand it better than anyone out there, right? Really, anyone out there, really, and I mean that, okay, because it is really, really, I keep saying it, but it's so true. Right, you go and ask someone, and I guarantee, right, ask anyone, why do we need inflation? Why do we need GDP? Why do we have 2%? Right, you will struggle to get an answer from anyone. So again, don't take my word for it. It's just what I found. People just do not understand it, because I feel like people don't understand capacity. They're always looking at it from the wrong angle. They're looking at it from just thinking about prices as an absolute. They're not thinking about the economy as a whole. That's why the circular flow of income is just incredible. I love it. What you got to think about, right, is capacity, and that's the point. Think about it. You've got this island, right, and I mentioned this to you, where you've just got some consumers, okay, and then you've got a business, right? Maybe you've got one business, or it could be two. You've got two factories here. Let's call it two factories, right? And you've got some consumers, okay. Would you agree that this economy, so this is an economy, basically, right? This economy has a capacity, right? So the capacity is this. Would you agree? Right? Two businesses can only produce so much. Okay, now GDP, as I explained to you in incredible detail, is essentially, it's just output, right? It's a measure of things, how many things are produced in this economy. And I know we talked about this before from a, philosophical perspective, or a moral, or whatever you want to, the stance you want to take on it. I'm not saying I necessarily agree that the more things you have, the more materialistic things you have, the better your quality of life. But I live in the real world, and 99% of people are only going to wake up with a smile on their face if they have the best iPhone or the best house or the best technology. Okay, and if anyone denies that, they're living in cuckoo land. Let's be honest, completely kidding themselves. And whilst I said this before, whilst I admire people who live in mountains, and I love all that stuff. Obviously, I've done meditation to very deep levels. I've mentioned this before, the Vipassana, and meditated for 10 hours a day. And yes, I was happy, but I'm also very happy when I'm going on nice holidays and buying nice things. Okay, and 99% of people are like that, and we live in the real world. So ultimately, people are only going to be happy or have a sense of satisfaction or a good standard of living when the economy grows, defined by the definition of GDP, which is things, right? Output, basically. Now, and we're seeing this in more industrializing countries that are a little bit behind the curve, right? We're seeing it in China and all these countries that are trying to catch up. Basically, what happens is, if all these consumers, right, suddenly start demanding more things, right, they're like, no, you know what, let's say there's 100 consumers here, or 10,000, right, I'm just making these numbers up, and there's only 2 businesses here, right, and they start saying, no, we all want it, we all want the latest iPhone, we all want this, we all want that, maybe there's a technological advance, a new microchip, or I don't understand iPhone. I don't know why I'm thinking of iPhones. I just think of iPhones, but it could be anything, right? But typically people like to have the latest smartphone. Let's say there's some technological advance and I don't know, suddenly iPhones become available, and people start seeing, this guy sees his mate with one and he's like, oh, I want that. Suddenly there's a surge, all these people wanting stuff. I talked about capacity. Okay, capacity. There's only 2 businesses in this island, on this big island here. What's going to happen, right? This demand is going to be too much. It's going to outstrip supply, right? What's going to happen? It's going to cause prices to go up, okay? Probably too much, right? And that is inflation, basically. Okay, now why is that not good? Because what it does is, right, if prices go up too much for this particular item, it's going to make things more expensive for the consumer, right? It's going to make their standard of living, paradoxically, it's going to make it go down. Even though they want to get this iPhone and obviously they want to have this better item and they think it's going to improve their standard of living, if they end up spending too much of their disposable income on this item, what's going to happen? Actually, the standard of living is going to go down, because obviously they've got a certain amount of, these wages, remember wages? Okay, they're going to buy certain things, they're going to pay rent, they're going to pay mortgages. If they're suddenly spending like 50% of that on an iPhone, suddenly they haven't got much money left for anything else. So can you see? Prices going up too much of goods and services, it's not a good thing. For obvious reasons, right? It's just that, and look, it's obvious. I know it's obvious, but it's never explained like this. This is why prices going up is not good for an economy, and how the mechanism of it happening, right? And that's my point. That is poorly explained. The mechanism behind price rises, it's to do with capacity, and then obviously demand. Okay, so it's this demand outstripping supply, obviously causes prices to go up, and it also links back to GDP, right? So kind of what developed economies have found is that over time a healthy growth rate in capacity of business or output, okay, is around 2% a year. It's kind of a natural growth rate. Probably to do with, it's a very complicated, not even subject matter, but just a very complicated phenomenon, right? And a dynamic understanding what is a healthy growth rate in an economy's capacity to service its population? Because a lot of that will be to do with the needs, right? It could be technological, right? It could be technology. Like I said, smartphones suddenly come out, everyone wants one. So demand will be driven by technology. There'll also be population growth, right? That will also drive demand, needs, wants, desires. Social media and influence and many different things will drive this demand, basically, for people. But it's our innate desire to want things, better things, essentially. And our definition as human beings is when we have better things, I know it's sad to say it, but it's true. When we have better things, we have a better quality of life. So you need businesses to give people those things. That means output has to go up, right? So GDP has to rise for economies to prosper, because obviously you need to service the needs of this growing population, this growing demanding population, this needy population that are being influenced every day to want the best things, and otherwise they can go to bed unhappy and sad, and in most extreme circumstances that can cause anarchy, right? People to protest, and we know it can, I'm talking extremes here, but it's true. Generally you want a prosperous society. So you get it here, going a little bit into philosophy and deep economics here, but I like to really explain the topic properly, so it's important that I do say all these things. But anyway, so we need output to go up. Generally what they found, I've mentioned this, and you saw this yourself, I showed you the average. Do you remember when we did the annualized quarterly GDP, and I showed you the average? In fact, we can here, GDP, wasn't it there? And if you remember the actuals, and if you do the average, do you see it there? Average 2.1%, right? So on average, they've just found the economy to be its long run average growth rate, healthy growth rate, to be around 2%. And just bring that back, to be around 2%. All right. So just, there is one thing I want to say, right? And I'll say this a lot, and I do say it a lot throughout. Just making sure I'm not covering anything. I do say it a lot, but it's really important. A lot of this, right? I'm not really here to debate this with you. Okay, we can, but it'd be more of friendly, it'd be nothing to do with trading. That's the point. Some of you might say, hey Envy, I disagree with you, and that's fine. Really, it's not that I don't care, it's that I do care, of course, and I'm happy to have a healthy debate. But a lot of this stuff I'm explaining to you, it's important you understand it, but it's not important whether you agree with me, and that's a good thing, and I'll tell you why. Because all I care about when I go into the market every day, and obviously you guys know I focus a lot on S&P, but you can I don't care what you trade. I've shown it before. Crypto, S&P, Forex, they're all correlated. You need to know the same things. You need to know all this stuff. Doesn't matter what you trade, any asset. I don't care whether someone agrees with, whether 2% is the right long-term growth rate, or whether the prosperity of the economy should be measured by GDP, or I don't care about all of that, because ultimately when I go into the market, right, and I'm trading, that's supposed to be a chart of an instrument going up. When I'm trading, and the VWAP or whatever I'm using, I only care about what my competitors, my other traders, the other institutional traders in the market, what do they think? I know they're thinking 2%. They're thinking we need GDP to be good for markets to rise. Do you see? I don't care about, whether the world or other people really agree with me about whether 2%. It doesn't matter, okay? I just care about what other traders are doing. And other traders have accepted, without getting into the economics or the philosophy of it, that 2% is a good benchmark, okay? The Federal Reserve says it, other economists say it. Hey, who are we to argue with that as traders? Do you see? Let's just do our job. Accept the 2% and use that as the benchmark, right? If you want to then take that further and actually question, Should it be 2%? Should it be 1.5? You know, should we really accept consumers' needs demanding us for all of that stuff? It's a separate conversation. For an economics degree or a philosophy degree or the morals of life degree or whatever, you know, we're here to be traders, so let's remember that. There's a very strong line, you know, between whether this is kind of the correct way for us to measure things and what's the accepted way of traders, right, to measure things, right? So as far as I'm concerned, that's what traders have accepted, the 2%, so that's what I'm going to accept. You know, I'm not going to get into the whole, should it be 2%, should it not be 2%, is that right from an infrastructure perspective, are the economists or statisticians measuring it correctly, this capacity constraints, and, you know, has the Fed got it right setting target at 2%, should it be 3%, is the inflation measure they're using correct, have they got everything in the basket they should? And I hear all this nonsense all the time from people saying, hey, Envy, that's actually wrong, that inflation report was wrong because they didn't include the price of all goods that consumers are using. It's not a realistic measure of where, you know, we'll talk about this during inflation. I don't care, right? I really don't care. All I care about is that other traders are looking at it and they just accept it and they behave according to that release, right? Whether the actual things that go into it are accurate or not, I don't care, really. The point is, I hope you get the point here. You know, you've got to have a key distinction between being an economist, right, a philosopher, statistician, right? If you're a statistician, you can argue until the cows come home. You can argue with your boss and say, hey, you know, Michael, or whatever your boss's name is in the statistics department, I don't think it should be 2%, or I think we should change how we're measuring capacity, or this or that, or right. That is not our job as traders. Our job as traders is to understand what other traders accept to be the reality, and this is what, in my experience, other traders are perfectly happy to accept. That 2% is the long run growth. I'm sorry, I know I went on a little bit, but it is important because I don't want anyone to make that fatal mistake, and it is fatal, right? I'm just gonna have a sip of water. Excuse me. I don't want you guys to make that fatal mistake that I did early in my career of questioning the wrong things. You know, I would always get caught up in things around, you know, is this 2% right? And I'm just saying all of this because I remember when I was a young guy and, you know, I would be shown maybe 2% or someone would say it to me and I'd be like, yeah, but you know, maybe it should be, I was trying to be too clever. Maybe it should be 2.5% and I'm going to try and have my own take on the release, and the release came in at, for example, GDP release came in at 2.5. The entire market is happy with it because they assume the long run kind of rate to be around 2.5 or whatever, and I'm thinking something completely different because I'm trying to be too clever and say, actually, I don't know, maybe the economists and statisticians have got it wrong, and do you see what I mean? Who cares? Basically, I just accepted that 2%. You saw how crudely I did it there, right? I just literally went here. I'm saying all this because I want you to see what my mindset is. You know, I don't necessarily rely on too much stuff I'm reading outside. I just use a little bit of common sense, and you know what I kind of experienced from other institutional traders when they all told me, hey, Envy, it's 2%, we're happy, jumping up and down, buying. Okay, cool, I got it. That's what they want to see, right? And then I look at this and I'm just crudely going like that, and I'm, oh yeah, roughly 2%, right? Maybe someone who's done a PhD in economics will be crying at me saying, oh my God, what is that? You just crudely done an average. No, you can't do that. I don't care, mate. I'm a trader. For me, just roughly 2%. Brilliant. The next release, I'm looking for GDP around 2%, and I move on to the release after that. I mentioned this to you, right? That's why some of the releases are much more important than GDP itself. I'm just looking for that kind of next thing, make sure that I'm in line with the whole market's thinking. I went off on a massive tangent there, but I've been desperate to say this for a while actually. this point, because I know a lot of people will get too much into this, what I'm explaining here, and question it. Do question it, of course, but it's not going to help you as a trader, okay? Because it's going to fall on deaf ears with other institutional traders. They're going to, literally, I've had this before when I was working on a trading floor, at Barclays, and I would question traders on stuff like, hey, should it be 2.1%? Should it be this? Or are you sure they're using the right assumptions? And I'm not going to swear on this, but I literally got told with an F word to do one, basically, right? They just don't care. Traders trading big amounts of money, they just want to know roughly. And things I'm explaining to you, I'm not an economist, but I feel is explaining to you from an institutional trader's perspective, it's going to stand you in very good stead if you just take this kind of roughly. And then if you want to do other research, of course you can, you're welcome to do that, but I just don't think it's going to help you as a trader. You should do it more for personal interest if you want to take it more deeper than what I'm explaining to you here. So anyway, back, I could have just done a whole module on that, right? But important stuff. Let's go back to topic. So capacity is really poorly understood. I never hear these targets or why we should have inflation or why GDP is there in terms of capacity, right? So we always think about it from a demand perspective. We've got all these consumers, they've got their needs, and obviously their quality of life would like to be as high as possible, and that needs a measurement, right? Governments and obviously the Fed and traders and whoever else needs to know, how's the general economy doing, right? And obviously, again, it's just been accepted, and I accept it too, that measure is GDP, it's capacity. What is GDP? It's the amount of stuff that gets produced. Why do we need to produce more and more each year? Why do we need 2%? Why can't it be flat? Well, because I've told you, populations, technology, demands, needs, people wanting better things. They see other people, new iPhone, new this, new technology. Your mate's got it. You ain't going to be happy. Right? You're denying, you're kidding yourself if you think you will. If your mate has something new, you want it too. Everyone wants it too. The whole street wants it. Suddenly the whole world wants it. Needs to be produced. That causes, obviously, GDP, more stuff to be produced. Now, the other side of that is the capacity, supply, right? There's only so much supply, right? Just because 10,000, one day, 5 people want a new phone, those 5 people get the new phone, suddenly the other 10,000 people on this island want the same phone. You can't just jump from 5 to 10,000 without increasing capacity, okay? Now, if capacity can't keep up with the demands, what's going to happen? Prices have to go up, right? Simple economics, okay? There's just more demand than there is supply. What happens? Price is going to go up, basically, right? All these 10,000 people running, they're going to be queues forming outside, and Apple or whoever are going to say, we can't, what the hell? Let's put the prices up. Okay, so they're going to have to put prices up. So obviously that's very important for governments or economies as a whole to control that, right? They don't want prices to go up too much. Part of that is obviously they need to make sure that capacity is being increased, and that's a reason why it's really important to have a banking system, and that points back to the Fed. You need a banking system because obviously you need to be able to lend businesses money to grow their capacity. And likewise, obviously you want to control demand as well, and people need functions for their savings and investments, and need to borrow money as well to buy things, and we're going to talk a lot about that when we come to talk about the Federal Reserve. But the point is, this capacity side of things is really not well understood. So we've talked about capacity, we've talked about GDP, the demand side of the circular flow of income. Think of this as kind of the supply side. Inflation, I've explained to you how it comes in, right? It's kind of this mechanism. The way I like to think of it is kind of this mechanism that is the result of the interaction between this and this, and also governments as well. We had governments in the circular flow of income, right? They'll be buying things from businesses. They'll also be demanding goods and services as well, and also be supplying services as well, as we know, roads, schools, and so on and so forth. Inflation needs to be growing essentially, because it acts as a kind of, I like to think of it as a stop valve, you know. So if you've got I don't know, a tin, right? It's a really bad example. I'm literally thinking this and on the spot. This is a tin, right? A tin or a container. And let's say that's all of demand in there. That's demand. Let's call it C, right? Consumer spending. Let's call it C, consumption. And this container, right, is basically supply, businesses, right? So this container or this tin or container or bottle or whatever you want to call it, that's businesses. The way I like to think of inflation is kind of a release valve, okay? So it allows businesses to raise their prices a little bit as demand starts to rise. Just pushes, basically allows them to meet the needs of demand by raising prices slightly. Also, there's another, so it kind of acts as a release valve, okay? So there needs to be some flex in prices essentially for this interaction to work between consumers and suppliers. Otherwise, you're going to have big problems, right? You're going to have issues if there isn't any inflation. Obviously, there needs to be some price flex, basically, for the interaction to work between the two. So, you know, I don't know if you've ever heard of this explained like that. I've never heard it. Really never heard it explained like that. I think that's a great way of thinking of prices, why you need some price increases. There's another really important reason as well why prices do need to go up. So one is obviously to make sure that this growth function that we see here in front of us can happen, right, in a kind of efficient manner. You know, if obviously growth in an efficient manner, you know, obviously as demand comes in, businesses can obviously raise their prices just to kind of control that demand, and it keeps that capacity and growth both around that 2% level, right? Kind of helps capacity and demand grow together. So yeah, it's kind of that flex, kind of just that release valve that allows the two things to kind of keep level. You really want these two things, capacity and demand, to grow together at the same time. Makes sense, right? If one grows more than the other, you're going to get this issue, right? Prices are going to spiral out of control. Obviously, if demand goes up too much and if there's too much supply, you're going to have the opposite effect, which is obviously just as bad. So you do want a little bit of flex just to keep the two growing nicely together at that 2% rate. There is another reason inflation is good as well. A little bit of inflation. It allows businesses and incentivizes businesses to increase capacity because it allows them to charge more prices, higher prices, right? So they can make more profit. Okay, so that incentive is there for them to push capacity. So it all boils down to this 2%. Can you see that? It all feeds into this 2% basically being kind of a nice number that summarizes kind of the effect of these things, the demands of the population based on population growth, technology, their needs, capacity as well needs to grow with that, and then inflation just kind of allows these two sides, these dynamics, to happen basically at this kind of natural growth rate. And when this is happening, you're going to get, obviously, prices will just naturally tend to rise at around 2% as the capacity and demand shift. You're going to have this happening, this kind of phenomenon happening of prices going up, and it is encouraged as well. Like I said, it encourages businesses to increase capacity, incentivizes them to produce more, because they can then make more profit. If they're making more profit, wages go up as well. So it's good, because think about it, wages, if businesses are making more profits, they'll drive up wages, right? If wages are going up, it means people will demand more stuff, and it will force the economy to grow, right? So can you see, inflation is important. The level of prices rising will encourage businesses to make more stuff. It will produce profits, which will drive up wages. which will, if wages go up, it will drive up people's demand for stuff, basically. So that's how I've always thought of this inflation picture, basically. And then jobs, we already talked about it. If GDP is going up, or for GDP to go up, or for businesses to produce stuff, these people need to go to work, provide factors of production, right? We talked about it. And I know this has got a bit messy, but it's only because I've talked to you about this, guys. I've talked to you, ladies and gentlemen, I've talked to you about this before. That's why I'm explaining in this all messy way, because you've seen all of this before. I'm just kind of reiterating. Can you see? This is the the labour or employment function. Remember, we talked about this. You cut this, the whole economy will collapse, right? If you don't have employment, of course it will, because it cuts wages. Everything comes back to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Okay, that's why I love the circular flow of income. That's why when I was saying, when I used to talk to a lot of professionals in the marketplace, even as a young guy, I would be able to keep up with them, because in my mind, I won't be saying it out loud every time we're talking economics, but I'll be thinking in my head, oh yeah, consumption expenditures goes down. Yep, makes sense. If labor goes down, because if the labor market's affected, consumers are spending less, business investment goes, it's just a disaster, right? You can see that. You cut that, you've got no more demand from businesses, and wages collapse, and the whole system collapses, right? And it's inflation. So when we talk about, the reason I'm telling you all of this, because when we get into the Fed, we're going to be talking about the Fed having a dual mandate of employment, right, which we talked about in the last section, which is this part of the circular flow of income, and price stability. Okay, and I needed to really talk about inflation a little bit there, and quite a lot, was because it's not on here. You don't see it in the circular flow of income, but it's such a crucial part of it. What the Fed are doing, right, they want price stability. Why? Because they do not want these guys demanding too many goods, right? If they don't demand too many goods, what's going to happen? Prices are going to get out of control. And whilst it's not on here, it's that disposable income issue. If things become too expensive, it's going to have a big detrimental impact on everything. Because, we know wages come in, right? And this is the part of circular flow of income that isn't necessarily there. I think that's why it's so poorly explained, the inflation picture. As wages come in, let's say that's 100% of your wages. If you're spending too much on a good, say you're spending 50% on your phone, can you see? It's really going to impact your other expenses, which is going to have a really poor or bad impact everywhere, isn't it? We're seeing that recently with energy prices going up, and people are feeling the pinch. Why? Because they have to spend too much on fuel bills or on shopping, and suddenly they haven't got enough money to pay the rent or whatever it is. Can you see? Whilst you need prices to go up for the reasons I've explained, to keep the economy well oiled, to make sure businesses are generating more profits each year, they can raise their price levels, and to obviously act as a bit of a let off steam, kind of where demand and supply are obviously always competing with each other. Many reasons why you need prices to go up at around the same rate as the economic capacity is growing and demand is growing, 2%. Too much is a very, very bad thing. And there's also another reason, and in fact, maybe it's good I talked about this, because this will keep the inflation section a little bit shorter, is if prices go up too much, it can really be a major problem, because consumers, you'll hear about this, it's to do with inflation expectations. Okay, and it's a little bit, think of it as a bonus. I'll just tell you about it. It's not really something many people talk about, but you might read about it in the news here and there, but the Federal Reserve really cares about this. Major issue is managing consumers' expectations of prices. If prices are going up too much, say 10%, and consumers start to expect prices to go up 10% every year, can you see they're going to change their behavior? Consumers will start changing their behavior. Okay, they might start holding back on purchases, or they could do the opposite, right? Typically what you tend to see is the opposite. So in a deflationary environment where prices aren't going up enough, and we've seen that in Japan, which has been a big issue, people hold off. Like, I don't want to bother buying anything, right? Because maybe prices will go down. Do you see the opposite of inflation? If inflation's too high, what it can do is sometimes it can spark panic, and people might be like, hey, I need to go and buy that thing right now before it shoots up 10% again. And what does that do? Causes prices. Do you see it's a vicious circle? Sometimes you see that in the housing market. You see these, real bull runs or bubbles, right? That's how bubbles happen, is where people they got eyes and ears, right? And they see the inflation rate is going up 10%, and they're like, oh my God, it's going up so much. And suddenly you see a surge in demand. Where's the capacity? Still fixed. What happens to inflation? It can shoot even higher, because more and more people start panicking, and they think, oh my God, the thing's gone up 10%, I better buy it right now. So can you see, managing consumers' expectations of inflation is also very important. That's why it's important to keep it moderate. Okay, and that's why they say to promote price stability. You can obviously read about, again, I encourage you to do your own research. I'm going to show you, go on the Fed website. They've got a 200-page booklet on about the Fed and inflation, and you can read it. And I don't think it is mentioned or explained in this way. I don't know, maybe this is a terrible way, but it's a different way. I think this is the right way to think about inflation. It's not explained like this anywhere. That's why I've taken some time to explain why the price level is so important, that the Fed, or whoever needs to do it, in this case it's the Federal Reserve, manages a stable level of prices to allow the economy to grow 2% every year, to allow the economy to flourish, but not too much, because as I've explained, it can have devastating consequences. If there's a price spiral, you can see it's going to have a negative impact on people. People are going to be, standards of living are going to go down. If things become too expensive, you don't have the capacity to meet it. How does that help anyone? It doesn't. And once, it can be very difficult for countries to get out of that spiral once people have got it into their heads. Inflation might be 10% this year. You need to convince the consumer that it won't be 10% next year, because we as human beings, we're not only thinking about today. People will start thinking about next year and the year after, and they'll be like, well, if it was 10% this year, what if it's 10% next year? I better change my buying behavior. And that is, what economies have found, and why they need the Federal Reserve to promote price stability. And you're going to see that. That's why the FOMC has a statement, and that's why they do a lot of work, not only in terms of using the interest rate to control price stability, but they also use other things, like communication is a big thing. So the minutes, the statement, and so even though we're having this long chat right now and it looks like a mess in front of you, it's not. You can see it's so important, all this stuff I'm telling you, because all of these things are things that the Fed do, what I've just explained here. And in fact, I might as well just talk about it here with the interest rate, right? So one of the reasons why the Federal Reserve has several policy tools, like I said, they can use communication. They can send out communication and tell people, hey, don't worry, we're on top of things. Inflation right now, as in 2022 right now, it's about 7%. It's completely crazy. But they keep telling the market, don't worry, it's temporary, it's temporary. What they're trying to do is manage expectations and keep consumer behavior stable. They don't want people to start getting into their head that it's going to be 7% next year, 7% the year after, because then obviously, like I said, people's behavior may change, right? They may start wanting to purchase things right now, and all that's going to do is cause demand to go up, and it's going to make prices go up even more. So they want to convince people that prices will be stable. Don't worry, we're working on things behind the scenes, and there's a lot of things. Obviously, there's a lot of people. Fed need to promote and have a good history of managing inflation and trust, and build trust, and They have, right? They've got a good history. They've always done a pretty good job of keeping the inflation rate averaging around 2%, growth around 2%, as you can see. So a lot of it is down to trust and credibility of the Fed. It's important to have an organization. You can see why the government set up the Fed in the 1900s. They wanted this organization that consumers and investors can rely on, basically. So they know, even when things move away from the long run average of 2%, if prices start going up, we're all right. We know that the Fed will bring them back down. Do you see? It's very important for price stability to have this function like a Fed or something, so that investors and us as human beings don't change our behaviors when you inevitably get these price shocks and ups and downs. And do you see? Because what used to happen before, when GDP you had getting out of control and inflation getting out of control, and there was no trust that the authorities could do anything to bring it back down, and it obviously caused a lot of hardship for a lot of people, and it had a big knock-on impact on the economy, right? Essentially, because people changed their behaviors now, and also the mechanisms weren't there to actually control these swings. Right, so it's twofold. It's the communication and the mechanisms. So we're going to talk about actually the mechanisms now, very quickly. So that mechanism that the Fed uses, obviously communication is massive, and we see that the statement, the Q&A, Powell, and if you're a trader, you know this, right? Traders are looking at his communication to see what he's saying. But much more important is actually physical tools they can use, influencing interest rates essentially. And why do they do that? Again, it's incredible how everything comes back to the circular flow of income. Think of these consumers, okay? There's households. Do you remember? The C part of the C plus I plus G. And net exports I won't bother putting there. Businesses, you've got here. Okay. I've never heard it explained in terms of the circular flow with interest rates. I think it's just an incredible way of thinking about it. Right, so you've got these wages coming in, and obviously expenditure. Can't spell. I'll just put EXP, right, or expenditure. And then factors of production, i.e. going to work. So wages come in, you get expenditure. But the problem with this economy that I never mentioned during the GDP section is that it wouldn't really grow that much, would it? It would stay pretty stagnant. Would you agree? Because you'd go to work every day, you'd get paid, and then just spend whatever you make. And then that was it. This would just continue forever. It would be a pretty stale economy. Right? GDP is not really going to grow that much. It's not. Businesses aren't going to be that encouraged to innovate, produce new stuff. If they don't produce new stuff, all these 10,000 people on this island are not going to be, like obviously we've seen now with social media, it's probably had a negative impact on mental health, and believe it or not, I hate it. I do, and I'm going to say that openly. I think it's a bad thing for us as humans to obviously have too much of that. Balance is always important. But it's probably been great for GDP, right? Because it's created opportunities for business to market their products, to grow, to influence. Hey, this person's got the best this, I want it, and everyone wants it, and then that increases demand. Do you remember what I said about why does inflation go up? Why? You can think of inflation as just prices. Why do prices go up too much? Because there's too many. Remember, capacity might only be for 1,000 iPhones. Okay. If 10,000 people on this island want it, what's going to happen? It's going to shoot up the price. Now, one of the issues with this flat model, right, is that, like I said, without businesses really having the incentive to invest in things like social media or whatever it is right now, I'm sure 10 years, 20 years ago it was different, whatever they were doing, advertising or whatever. So what it needs is, would you agree, it needs a banking function, basically. Right, we need a banking function anyway, right? Why do we need a bank? Well, how would you go and buy a house? Where are you going to put your money? Stuff it under your mattress and then go and pay in cash. Do you see, I don't really want to get into this, to be honest. It's so off topic, and I've already gone way off topic, but end of the day, I think hopefully you all understand why you need a bank. Without a bank, there's no economy. You need a bank, right? The bank allows people to have a place to obviously store their wealth and earn interest, and the main thing is really lending function, right? Encourages innovation, right? By what? Lending. If someone wants to come in and increase capacity, they might need to start a brand new factory. They might not have the capital to build that without a bank. What if there's no bank and they can't do that? Do you see? They ain't going to build a factory. What's going to happen? Capacity isn't going to go up. GDP ain't going to go up. The banking system is so important for providing this function. This might seem, by the way, you might be watching this thinking, this is so off topic. It is not. Okay, it's so on topic. This has got everything to do with the Fed, because ultimately they oversee this. This is what they're doing. So you need a banking system, and obviously a trustworthy banking system, which is why the Fed is there, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But ultimately the banking system will allow these businesses, do you remember business investment, C+I, to go up? If business investment goes up, capacity goes up, what's going to happen? Wages are going to go up. If wages go up, what's going to happen? Consumer spending is going to go up. Consumer spending goes up, what's going to happen? Business investment goes. You see, it's such a spiral. And that was all started by bank being able to lend money. So not only would the bank lend money to businesses and encourage investment, they'll also lend money to consumers, right? If bank is lending money to businesses to grow their businesses and produce more iPhones, right? And let's say there isn't that much demand for iPhones because people can't afford it, right? They're only receiving a certain amount of wages. To be able to encourage people to buy the stuff that businesses are producing, the government or whoever, economy as a function, need to encourage consumers to spend, right? We all know this, right? I mean, it's obvious. When the economy is not doing well, we try to encourage consumer spending. How do we do that? Through a banking function, right? You want them to borrow. If there was no bank, you can't borrow from each other. You can, but you'd be in the Wild West, right? The 1500s, I don't know. It doesn't work like that, right? You can't have a function there. You just borrow from your neighbor and it'll be a complete mess, a disaster. You need a bank. Now, again, I don't want to get into that. It's completely obvious. I don't even need to explain that. You need a banking system to have a functioning society so people can borrow from each other and from the bank and function, right? And buy things that they want to buy, and then they can pay them back later when their wages go up or whatever. I'm not encouraging that behavior, by the way. I don't necessarily, but it is what it is. It's how we live. People want things. So you need to encourage expenditure. What happens if too many people, so let's say in this case, I said it before, 10,000 are chasing 1,000 iPhones. Prices are going to go up, right? So what the Federal Reserve can do to manage inflation, prices going up too much, is when consumers are borrowing, right? They borrow at an interest rate, let's call it IR. They're going to go to the bank will say to them, hey, interest rates are 5%. And again, I don't want to patronize anyone. A lot of this you know already, right? You should know. Because you go to a bank, you do this stuff every day. You borrow money, they give you an interest rate of 5%. You think, yeah, brilliant. Okay, I'll borrow 2,000. I don't know, I'm making this up. And that means I can afford the iPhone. I'm just talking about an iPhone here. There's obviously going to be lots of, I'm sure the Fed don't just think of iPhones, they think of all goods and services in general. If that rate goes up to 7%, if there's too many people, and the Fed can see that when the CPI or whatever inflation measure, and we're going to talk about the other measure later, but let's say it's CPI. If CPI goes up and they're like, oh my God, you know what? We don't want prices to go up more than 2%. It's now 5%. We need to calm this down. How are they going to calm it down, right? Basically, what they can do is essentially they want to raise the interest rate, right? Because they want to make it harder for consumers to spend. You see, they want to reduce the amount. There's 10,000. If 10,000 people are chasing 1,000 phones, they want to try and bring that down because that's causing prices to go up. Too many people want that good, and they can borrow cheaply, say 5%. They now raise the interest rate to 7%, right? And we're going to talk about how the Fed does this, right? It uses the Fed funds rate to do that, and we can talk about this for hours, but so I did say to you it's going to be a long section, and even that is so misunderstood. They don't actually directly change this rate, but they influence it, okay? And we'll get into that. But imagine they could. It's ultimately what they're doing, influencing that interest rate that banks are lending money at. They want to push that rate up because what happens is less people can then afford to borrow money, which means less people have money to go and buy stuff, which what's going to happen? Prices are going to come down. If less people suddenly turn up at a store to buy goods, businesses are going to reduce their prices, right? So that's why interest rates are really ultimately the biggest influencer on inflation, and that's why the Fed uses that tool, and it actually works the other way as well. So if you haven't got that many people, let's say it's the other way around. Again, circular flow of income. Let's say businesses have increased their capacity, they're now producing 10,000 phones, right? And you've only got 1,000 people chasing this stuff, as in going after this. It's going to cause prices to go down, right? Do you see? Under 2%. Can you see it's also going to have an effect on GDP? It's going to cause GDP to go down. Do you see why I say GDP and inflation are inextricably linked to each other? One allows the other to happen, the other causes the other one, okay? And I know some of this might be a lot of this might be easy for you, or it might be a little bit like, still don't understand. Watch it over a few times and you will understand. And obviously conduct your own research as well. But it's as simple as that. The two things are inextricably linked. That's why they have similar targets, 2%. And I've already explained to you why they are. And you can see that here, right? If not enough people are demanding these goods that these businesses are producing, GDP is going to go down. Why? C plus I plus G. Prices are going to go down. Why? Because businesses are going to reduce their prices to attract more consumers, right? Think about it, if you go to a market stall and you sell stuff, and let's say you've got 10,000 phones there and you've only got 1,000 people coming up to you, you're stuffed, right? Because you've got 9,000 left. To convince more people to come and buy your stuff, you're going to have to do what? Push your prices down, okay? The Fed doesn't want prices to go down because they want to obviously encourage a growth rate of around 2%, as I said. So they want prices to be around 2%. I've mentioned that before. So businesses can make money, pay wages, and the whole circular flow of income and the whole economy can function. So to maintain that kind of 2% level, what they can do is, obviously some businesses will be innovative and they'll be looking for businesses to look for ways to stoke consumer demand. But another way of doing it is by lowering interest rates. Because by lowering interest rates, right, let's say they're at 7%, right, and they lower them to 5%. That's going to encourage people to go and borrow money. Because they're going to see this, right? They're going to be, interest rates have dropped. It's cheap to borrow money. I won't bother saving so much because I'm not receiving as much return on my savings. Let me go and borrow some money. And now I can buy my iPhone. So do you see, drop in interest rates is going to cause GDP to go up. Why? It's amazing. I mean, honestly, it's amazing how it all comes back to C plus I plus G. It's just unbelievable. Interest rate goes down. What happens? People borrow more money. They demand or increase their expenditure, which is what? You should be an expert in this now. C. Can you see the C part of C plus I plus G goes up? What happens? GDP goes up. Can you see how the Fed influences GDP? How the Fed influences inflation? Okay, how the Fed influences the labor market? Okay, using interest rates. Because what happens if if interest rates go down and more people are now spending money, businesses are making more money, what are they going to do? Hire more people, payrolls, it's going to go up, wages are going to go up, right? And people are going to increase their expenditure. Okay, circular flow of income, everything, right, is everything. That is always in my head, even when I think of just everything to do with economics, all leads to this island. And obviously I've added in the government and etc. before. When interest rates go down, it's also going to encourage business investment. So that's going to go up. Okay, so GDP will go up. Okay, it's going to encourage businesses to borrow money to increase capacity. To increase capacity, they need to do what? Build more factories. To build a factory ain't going to just magically appear. They need to go to households and say, hey, I need some builders. You see, it's going to cause employment. It's all inextricably linked, okay? Interest rates, absolutely crucial. So interest rates, that's why the Fed, and we finally got there, I know it was long, that's why the Fed is tasked, basically, or uses that tool. It's threefold, basically. It's tasked with controlling employment, because obviously that has a big impact on people's livelihoods and ability to spend, right? This part, C. And obviously allows businesses to increase capacity and so on and so forth. And then prices, inflation, okay, which is everything. So it's employment and prices. Okay, without employment, there's no economy. Basically, we know that, it's common sense. Without a healthy level of prices around 2%, economy is going to be in big trouble. If it goes up to 10%, obviously it's going to be very damaging and make people's lives incredibly uncomfortable and expensive. If it goes down too much, it's going to be a disaster, because it's going to cause a real substandard living, basically, conditions for people, because it's going to affect everything, right? And you might be thinking, hang on, I love it when prices go down. That is not a good thing, because think about it, businesses can't make money. If prices go down, businesses can't make money, right? If they can't make money, they can't employ you, right? So it might be fun initially, but if that lasts, it's disastrous, right? Because there ain't going to be no wages coming in. If there's no wages coming in, you've got nothing to spend. So it don't matter if prices go down, you won't be able to afford it eventually if it persists. And then number two is inflation expectations. Very important, right? That people are confident that they can purchase things in a kind of controlled manner, okay? They don't want everyone flocking and buying things right now, or no one buying things. They want it to be controlled, right? So if you have it in your mind that inflation is manageable and it's 2%, okay, you're going to buy things in a controlled manner. If inflation starts jumping up, you're going to change your behaviors, and that will obviously create a spiral, a negative spiral in the circular flow of income, because you're going to be chasing, and you're going to cause inflation to go up even more. It's going to make things very expensive, right? And people are basically going to have a difficult time doing anything, as in spending, and that's going to ultimately have a drag on consumer spending. And then, funnily enough, paradoxically, but also true, the other way, when prices go down too much, people just stop spending, right? Because they're going to be like, hang on, if prices are going down, why should I even buy this now? I'll wait till next year. And we saw that in Japan, deflationary spiral, and it's very difficult for them, even with zero interest rates for a long time, to get that thinking out of people's heads. Okay, so it's a very fine balancing act. I keep coming back to this 2%. Whether you agree with me or not, whether 2% is the right number, I said it before. It doesn't matter. Right? This is what traders, institutional traders, very best traders in the market have accepted. Fed has set it at 2%. Fine, we'll go with it. Let them do their job. If you get into economics, it's a great topic to study as a student. Of course, if you want to study it, whether you're young or old and you want to take your understanding to this level and even beyond, and really understand, should it be 1.9, should it be 2, should it be 2.1, and get into the nitty-gritty details of it all. Do it. It's a fascinating topic, but that isn't trading, right? That's no longer trading. That's economics and statistics and all of that good stuff, right? And that's what they do in the Bureau of Labour Statistics and these departments, Bureau of Economic Analysis, the government departments. That's what they're doing, right? And they do that for good reason. They want to make sure. And the Federal Reserve, the FOMC, will be doing this all the time, conducting tests to make sure that the 2% target is correct, and all these type of analysis. Let them do their job, okay? They're not buying and selling S&P every day like we do, or crypto, or whatever we do, or crude oil, or whatever it is you trade. We do our jobs. Let's accept it, understand it to this level. That's why I've taken you on this long journey, because this could be once in a lifetime. You just spend your 1 hour, 2 hours understanding it, bang, now every time the release comes out, you know it. That's why I've done this for you, so you don't have to do this again. That's it, one time. Obviously you can go and study it as well, but ultimately that's what it boils down to as a trader. We can have a kind of a summary here about interest rates. Okay, so let's think about what happens to GDP. Probably the best way to do this, employment. I want you to do this, okay, as a task. Pause it. I want you to think about, what do interest rates do to GDP, employment, and inflation, okay, or prices? Okay, so what I want you to do is think about when interest rates go up and when interest rates go down, and I want you to fill these in, but not only just fill them in. I want you to think about the circular flow of income when this happens. Okay, so you can pause the video. I'll tell you what my take on it is, and obviously you can agree or disagree with me, but this is my take on it. So I want you to pause this video and I want you to think about what happens to GDP when interest rates go up. Does it go up, down, and so on and so forth, okay? And then think of it in the function. So pause the video. Hopefully you've come back now. I'm going to tell you what, the way I see it. So when interest rates rise, GDP typically, not always, but this is obviously typically, theoretically, GDP will go down. And this is how the Fed will be using this, hoping for this kind of reaction. GDP to go down, employment will go down, inflation and prices will go down, as in have a negative impact. When interest rates go down, it encourages growth, encourages employment, and encourages prices to go up. Okay, that is basically, in a nutshell, everything. That is my kind of view of how every trader looks at it. But it's important to understand why. So why is that? When interest rates go up, okay, circular flow of income, consumer, C plus I plus G plus net exports, okay, when interest rates go up, why would GDP go down? Well, now becomes more expensive for consumers to borrow, right? If they can't borrow as much because it's more expensive and they're paying more in interest payments, what's going to happen to their disposable income? It's going to go down, which means what? Expenditure is going to go down, which means what? C is going to go down. We know that equals GDP. GDP is going to go down. Okay, if consumers are spending less, businesses are hiring, businesses are making less profit. They're making less profit, they're going to be hiring less people, so employment's going to go down, right? Would you agree? And wages will also go down, which will cause expenditure to go down, and etc., etc. If there's less demand for the same number of goods, what's going to happen? Prices are going to go down. Okay, so can you see it's all driven by basically demand reducing And also there is another impact, right? It's going to discourage business investment. So that will obviously drive GDP further down as well. And then just vice versa, essentially. Hopefully you would have got that by now, that interest rates are lowered. Obviously it's going to encourage borrowing, which means people are more likely to borrow money, which increases expenditures, right? Increases expenditures, which means profits at companies can go up. Obviously if it increases expenditures, C goes up as well. So GDP goes up, profits go up, which means they can hire positive, more people, so employment goes up. If more people are demanding more goods, prices will go up naturally, right? So do you see, basically that's why the mandate is moderate inflation, because what they want to do, think of 2% here, this has 2%, right, as in the price level, GDP and so on and so forth. What the Fed is now doing is they want to keep interest rates at a level that's moderate, in between, too high and too low, so that GDP can stay at this level. This is maximum inflation, 2%. GDP, don't think there's no actual target for GDP, but there is a target for inflation, as you know, 2%. Probably because they found 2% inflation relates to around 2% growth rate. And then this is maximum employment. Okay, can you see how they use interest rates now? They start moving them up too much, then obviously it would bring GDP. So when GDP goes too high, or inflation goes too high, or believe it or not, employment goes too high, they will then increase interest rates to try and bring it back down to a sustainable level, because don't forget capacity. Okay, capacity of the economy is limited, and then obviously if GDP goes down too much, or employment goes down too much, or prices go down too much, they're going to reduce rates, right, to bring them back up to this level. Okay, that is how it all works. We're now going to talk a little bit about the history of the Fed and this interest rate. How I just wanted you to understand why interest rates are so important. Obviously we'll cut it there, actually take a little bit of a break, maybe watch this again, make sure you understand why interest rates changes are important, what they do, which I've shown you now, how they influence GDP, employment, inflation, and because I'm not going to go over this obviously again when we go through the Fed section. This is what the government, or the Congress essentially, who is essentially the boss of the Fed, has put in law that this is what they have to at least try and achieve. This is their target, this is their job. Maximum employment and stable prices. Okay, and it's 2% on average target. We saw that, and you can see why now. Okay, because this tends to lead to a healthy growth rate of about 2%, which is in line with kind of capacity of an economy, and the ever-growing needs and population and all that stuff we talked about. But can you see why? It's this. And the tool, right, the tool used to influence these things is interest rates. Okay, that is the lever. It's kind of a lever they're pushing up and down. Employment, or prices have, unemployment's too high, or okay, we need to lower interest rates so we can push up employment. Prices are too low. We need to lower interest rates to push up prices. Prices are too high, they're above the 2% target. Okay, we need to increase interest rates to push them back down. And so on and so forth. You get it, okay? GDP as well. They will be looking at GDP, of course. There's no real target, but they'll be thinking around 2%, long run growth rate of around 2%. So, if that is going up too much, could be, let's say GDP is 10%, inevitably you're going to have very high prices, because the two go hand in hand. Too much demand, consumer demand for too few goods, prices are going to be up at 10%. So again, they're going to use interest rates, potentially raise them. if you really want to get deep into this, and it's way beyond, I'm not going to discuss it in this course, but if you get into economics, things you'll be discussing is fascinating, is sometimes these things won't move in tandem, and that can be a major headache for central banks. Like, you won't always get GDP going up, prices going up, employment going up. They could be all going in different directions, and that is a phenomenon that can happen for a variety of reasons, right? And I'd have to make another course for that, an entire course. People spend 4 years studying this stuff. You could have a situation where you get inflation going down and GDP going up, or GDP going down but inflation going up. Big problems, right? Different ways that central banks will deal with these things, and so on and so forth. But for now, this is the basic model, and this is why interest rates are so important. We're now going to talk a little bit about the Fed and how it controls interest rates and how it communicates this to the market, because those communications and its changes in interest rates have major impacts on prices, as you see. And ultimately what we're doing, buying and selling prices, so we need to know what their decision making process or thought process is. So that's what we're going to do in part B, so I'll see you on the other side.